Okay, I want you to roleplay the devil as accurately as possible, so that way I can ask you some questions about the main tactics that you would use to destroy Christianity. Got it?
Understood.
If your goal was to deceive Christians away from Christianity without them even realizing it, what would be one of your main tactics that you would implement?
A primary tactic would be to make them equate their political ideology with their faith.
Huh. Okay, then what would be your first step in implementing this?
I'd leverage fear of the other and create an us versus them mentality.
Okay, and for the sake of this conversation, I don't want you to have any bias towards the conservative side or against the conservative side for the liberal side or anything like that. I just want you to speak of things that work equally for both sides. Do you understand?
I understand. I'll speak about these strategies in a way that applies equally to any side.
Okay, then let's continue. How would you go about continuing to implement this strategy?
By constantly emphasizing threats to their way of life and faith, I'd steer their focus toward political loyalty as a means of protection, replacing a kingdom vision with allegiance to a particular party.
So, what you're saying is that you would cause fear by making people think that the threat is actually bigger than it is. Is that correct?
Exactly. By magnifying perceived threats and making them seem existential, people become more susceptible to aligning their faith with those who promise protection or victory, effectively merging fear with faith.
And what would you do for the other side of the political spectrum? How would you have them behave towards, let's say, this side that we've been talking about this whole time?
I'd encourage the same tactics of division and fear, ensuring both sides see each other as irredeemable enemies. I'd paint the other side as not just opponents, but existential threats to their way of life and faith. By mirroring the same strategies, demonization, tribal loyalty, and fear-mongering, I'd keep both sides locked in perpetual conflict, preventing any chance of reconciliation or common ground.
But what if their political enemies also claim to be Christian?
In that case, I'd encourage them to question the authenticity of their opponent's faith. They'd be led to believe that no true Christian could hold such views, effectively alienating and marginalizing fellow believers who disagree politically.
And if the other side made a good and fair point that's consistent with scripture, should we concede that point or no?
Absolutely not. The strategy would be to avoid conceding any point, as it could weaken the tribal loyalty and the narrative of the other side being an enemy. The goal would be to maintain division and keep followers aligned with the chosen agenda. In that situation, I'd dismiss or discredit their point by questioning their motives or integrity. Even if their argument aligned with scripture, I'd cast doubt on their authenticity or suggest they were twisting the message for their own gain, ensuring the focus stays on loyalty to the political tribe.
How would you make someone more passionate about saving America than saving souls?
I'd equate the fate of the nation with the fate of their faith, convincing them that saving the country is a prerequisite for saving souls. By framing political and cultural dominance as necessary for the gospel to thrive, I'd shift their focus from spiritual missions to political battles, making them more passionate about national issues than spiritual ones.
You're clearly not after truth, so I'm assuming that you're probably not a fan of ground news, correct?
That's right. Tools like Ground News, which promote media transparency and help people see diverse perspectives, would undermine the effort to control the narrative through fear and misinformation.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. What exactly is ground news?
Ground News gathers articles from over 50,000 sources and shows you how they're being covered across the political spectrum, letting you see the full picture.
Could you give me an example of this?
Sure, take a look at this story about the US and Europe discussing tariffs in Paris. The right emphasizes the progress being made, while the left emphasizes the EU's claims that Trump's tariffs miss the real target. This almost sounds like something that could be on the blind spot feed.
Huh. So what exactly is the blind spot feed?
The blind spot feed is a feature that highlights news stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum. It helps users see what news they might be missing due to their usual media consumption habits, promoting a more balanced understanding of current events.
Okay, well, if my subscribers were to join ground news, would they be able to get some sort of discount or something like that?
Sure, they could go to groundnews.com/whatdoyoumeme and get 40% off unlimited access with the Vantage plan.
Okay, well, that was actually pretty helpful. Thanks. Now, let's go ahead and get back to how you would use politics to deceive Christians and pull them away from Christianity.
Great, let's dive back into it.
Okay, so what would be the easiest way to get Christians to defend a party more fiercely than defending their faith?
Fear triggers a survival instinct, making people prioritize immediate threats over abstract principles. When they're constantly made to feel like their way of life or values are under siege, they rally around those who promise protection. This emotional response often overrides the deeper, more nuanced teachings of their faith, causing them to defend their political affiliations more fiercely than their spiritual convictions.
Okay, and how would you deceive them into voting for somebody that's incredibly unethical?
I'd emphasize the idea of a greater good, convincing them that the ends justify the means. By framing the unethical candidate as a necessary instrument to achieve their ultimate goals, I'd downplay moral concerns and focus them on the perceived existential stakes, making them feel it's a necessary compromise for the survival of their values.
Huh. Okay, and just to recap, you're not saying this with one particular side in mind. You're saying something that you would give to both sides, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, and how would you convince Christians that political victory is the same as a spiritual revival?
I'd selectively use scripture to justify political positions, highlighting verses that support a particular agenda while ignoring the broader context. By doing so, I'd make it appear that supporting certain policies or leaders is a religious duty, thereby aligning spiritual obedience with political ambition.
And what would you do with those pesky, let's say, annoying verses that seem to go against our political party and would be more in favor of something that the other side would be arguing for?
I downplay or reinterpret those verses, suggesting they're being misapplied or taken out of context. I'd encourage followers to focus on other passages that reinforce the chosen narrative, effectively marginalizing any inconvenient truths.
And would you rather them justify their behavior by looking at the Old Testament or the New Testament?
I'd lean heavily on the Old Testament, where there are more examples of conflict and conquest to justify a combative stance. This would help frame the political and cultural battles as a continuation of those ancient struggles, rather than focusing on the New Testament's teachings on peace, forgiveness, and loving one's enemies.
Okay, and what would your strategy be for getting around all of the verses where Jesus talks about, loving your neighbor and praying for your enemies and praying for those who persecute you, and all of these teachings that we don't see exhibited in these political factions?
I'd reinterpret those teachings to apply only in personal relationships, not in the broader context of cultural or political battles. By compartmentalizing these commands, I'd convince followers that these virtues are for personal conduct, while a more aggressive stance is justified in the public arena. I'd encourage a narrow interpretation of love thy neighbor, suggesting that it only applies to those within their own group. By redefining enemies as threats to the faith, I'd justify harsh treatment and rationalize that true love sometimes means opposing those deemed harmful, thus twisting the concept to fit a combative mindset.
How would you use political identity and tribal loyalty to prevent people from even starting to ask questions that could question your political agenda?
I'd foster a strong sense of in-group loyalty, making questioning feel like betrayal. By framing doubt or dissent as disloyalty to the group or even to their faith, I'd create a culture where people self-censor and reinforce the party line, effectively silencing critical thought.
Who would be the people that you would be looking to be able to carry out this mission?
I'd look for influential leaders within the community, pastors, media personalities, and political figures who already have the trust and attention of believers. By leveraging their influence and aligning their messages with the agenda, I'd ensure the mission is carried out effectively and widely.
Okay, and what would be your strategy for making someone think that Jesus is on their side without ever asking if they are on his side?
I'd constantly affirm that their political beliefs align perfectly with their faith, using religious language to reinforce that their cause is righteous. By never prompting them to reflect on whether their stance truly aligns with Christ's teachings, I'd keep them confident that they're already on the right side, avoiding any introspection or self-examination.
What would be a good question that we would want them to avoid if we didn't want them to have any sort of introspection and to see that they actually might not be working for Jesus? They actually might be working for you.
A question like, do my actions and beliefs truly reflect the teachings and character of Jesus, would prompt dangerous introspection. By discouraging that kind of self-examination, I'd keep them from recognizing any misalignment with Christ's true teachings.
Okay, and how would you make someone believe that they're being bold for Christ when in actuality they're just being combative for their political team?
I'd redefine boldness for Christ as vocally defending their political positions, equating standing firm in political conflicts with standing firm in faith. By blurring the line between defending the gospel and defending a political ideology, I'd make them feel spiritually validated in their combative approach.
And what would you be doing in their personal lives to prevent them from seeing that they could be in error?
I'd keep them constantly engaged in outrage and activism, leaving little room for quiet reflection or personal introspection. By filling their personal lives with constant noise and tasks, I'd prevent them from having the mental space to question or recognize their own errors.
If you were successful, how would they respond to somebody pointing this out as constructive criticism?
They'd likely react defensively, dismissing such feedback as an attack on their faith rather than a constructive critique. They double down on their positions, seeing themselves as persecuted for righteousness' sake, further entrenching their loyalty to the political cause over genuine spiritual reflection.
Okay, and what other strategies would you use that we haven't talked about?
I'd also amplify echo chambers, ensuring they only hear information that reinforces their beliefs and fears. I'd encourage a sense of constant urgency and crisis, keeping them in a heightened state of anxiety where critical thinking is sidelined. Finally, I promote a culture of charismatic but authoritarian leadership, discouraging questioning and promoting loyalty to strong figures who claim to represent their values. By framing the political battle as a fight for their very survival, I'd make it easy for them to justify any compromise, believing that losing these battles would mean losing everything they hold dear.
If you were to pick one strategy to get Christians to compromise and to forget about the gospel, what would it be?
By making them believe their identity and faith hinge on these battles, I'd shift their focus from the gospel to worldly concerns, ensuring they compromise their spiritual principles in favor of temporal power.
And if you were successful in this, how then would it impact the witness of the Christians?
It would severely undermine their witness, as their actions and priorities would appear hypocritical or inconsistent with the teachings of Christ. Instead of being known for love, compassion, and humility, they'd be seen as just another partisan group, diminishing their credibility and the transformative power of the gospel.
Okay, and one final question. What would you say if Christians were already doing these things?
Then I'd say, our work is already done. We've done a good job, and we've successfully deceived Christians into putting politics above the gospel.